March 23, 1945, 2100 hours, western bank of the Rhine River near Wesel, Germany. As night slowly settled over the Rhine, Oberst Wilhelm Steinberg stood on the western embankment, methodically surveying the waterway through his binoculars. His hands were steady, his notes precise. Every observation was carefully recorded in a field journal, pages that would later resurface among the seized records of the German Army Group headquarters. In his mind, the situation remained clear. The Americans had finally reached Germany's most revered natural barrier, yet Steinberg was convinced they had reached a dead end. The Rhine, he believed, could not be taken by force. No attacking army in German military history had ever crossed it under determined resistance without constructing bridges, and bridges meant time, exposure, and destruction. As dusk deepened, distant artillery lit up the far bank in rhythmic bursts. Thousands of Allied guns were firing for preparation for what German commanders assumed would be a conventional river assault. Doctrine dictated that such an operation would require prolonged engineering efforts, fixed crossing sites, and predictable choke points. All of these, Steinberg knew, could be systematically annihilated by German artillery, especially the feared 88mm guns positioned to dominate the river approaches. For nearly 2,000 years, the Rhine had served as Germany's shield. Even in the spring of 1945, with the Reich collapsing under pressure from both east and west, military engineers continued to reassure commanders that the river's formidable width, over 1,300 feet in places, and its fast-moving current made an assault crossing without extensive preparation practically impossible. On the Allied side, however, an entirely different reality was unfolding. Approximately 2,000 soldiers from the 7th Battalion of the Black Watch, part of the British 51st Highland Division, were preparing to cross the river. They were not boarding fragile assault boats that would shuttle troops back and forth under fire, nor were they waiting for engineers to assemble pontoon bridges while enemy shells rained down. Instead, they climbed into vehicles that German intelligence had disastrously misunderstood. These were DUKWs, amphibious trucks with boat-like hulls capable of driving directly into the river and emerging intact on the opposite shore. German forces had encountered such vehicles before, in Normandy and Italy, but intelligence analysts had dismissed them as niche landing craft, useful only for beach invasions and irrelevant to inland river warfare. That assumption was about to prove fatal. The carefully calculated logic underpinning the Rhine's defense was on the verge of collapse, not because of superior Allied numbers or unprecedented firepower, but due to an industrial and logistical innovation that German planners never believed could be deployed against their last great natural obstacle. What had been imagined as an impassable moat was about to become a corridor for Allied forces. This failure had roots stretching back months. German intelligence assessments had consistently underestimated American amphibious capabilities. General Oberst Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would later explain during Allied interrogations how deeply flawed these evaluations had been. Reports from Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy repeatedly mentioned Schwimmwagen-like transport trucks, vehicles that could swim, but analysts categorized them as symbols of American excess rather than serious military assets. They were spoken of in the same dismissive tone as floating ice cream factories or mobile Coca-Cola units. Among the German defenders was Major Hans-Georg Model, the son of Field Marshal Walter Model, serving with the 1st Parachute Army. His personal diary, recovered after his surrender in April 1945, would later offer historians a rare glimpse into the mindset of Germany's experienced officer corps. These were men who had studied river crossings across Europe, from the Dnieper to the Seine, and believed they fully understood the unchanging principles of amphibious warfare. According to their doctrine, attackers required overwhelming artillery dominance, specialized bridging equipment, and, above all, time. Time to establish crossings, time during which defenders could concentrate fire and destroy the assault. What they did not anticipate was an enemy capable of bypassing these stages entirely. Captured intelligence files revealed just how little attention had been paid to the threat. Hauptmann Friedrich Wenzel, an intelligence officer with the 15th Army, had compiled extensive reports on Allied materiel. Over a 6-month period, the DUKW appeared only 3 times in his documentation and never as a decisive factor. By the time the truth became undeniable, it was already too late. German assumptions built on tradition and precedent were being dismantled by a form of warfare they had seen but never truly understood. For years, Allied intelligence summaries consistently underestimated a curious American vehicle, categorizing it as nothing more than specialized equipment intended for coastal landings. Analysts dismissed its usefulness for inland waterways and concluded that only a handful, perhaps 50 to 100, were scattered across the entire European theater. These assumptions were profoundly wrong. By early 1945, the scale of deployment bore no resemblance to those estimates. More than 2,000 DUKW amphibious trucks were operating throughout Europe. The United States Army had formally structured them into dedicated amphibious truck companies, each unit fielding approximately 50 vehicles with crews trained specifically for riverine operations. Since the Normandy landings, these formations had rehearsed river crossings repeatedly, refining tactics and procedures that never surfaced in German intelligence assessments. American allies expanded this capability even further. Through the Lend-Lease program, Britain received roughly 2,000 DUKWs and adapted them with their own tactical refinements. Canadian forces employed an additional 800 vehicles, modifying them for cold weather service to meet the demands of northern European climates. The origins of the Duck trace back not to grand strategy, but to an unremarkable mishap along the Massachusetts coast. In April 1942, a U.S. Coast Guard patrol vessel became stranded on a sandbar near Provincetown. Standard wheeled trucks were unable to reach it through the surf and loose sand. What appeared to be a minor logistical frustration became the catalyst for a transformative idea in amphibious transport, one that would later play a decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany. Palmer K. Lett Putnam, working under the Office of Scientific Research and Development, took up the challenge. He collaborated with yacht designer Rod Stevens Jr. and engineer Dennis Piston to conceptualize a vehicle capable of traveling seamlessly between sea and shore. When Ford Motor Company declined the proposal, judging the development timeline unrealistic, General Motors Corporation agreed to proceed. On April 23, 1942, GMC formally accepted the contract. Work commenced immediately at GMC's Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company in Pontiac, Michigan. Engineers and designers operated continuously, day and night. Remarkably, just 38 days later, on June 2, 1942, the first prototype emerged. The vehicle merged the proven mechanical base of the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck with a fully sealed hull designed by Sparkman & Stevens, a firm renowned for yacht architecture. The vehicle's designation followed GMC's internal coding system. D indicated the 1942 model year, U stood for utility, K signified all-wheel drive, and W denoted dual rear axles. Behind this simple label lay a set of innovations that made the Duck uniquely versatile. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from GMC engineer Frank Spear, who developed the world's first central tire inflation system. This allowed drivers to alter tire pressure while the vehicle was in motion. Reduced pressure, between 10 and 12 pounds per square inch, enabled the tires to spread and grip soft terrain such as sand or mud. Higher pressure, up to 45 psi, restored efficient road performance. Water propulsion was provided by a 25-inch propeller connected to the main transmission through a transfer case. In the water, the Duck could achieve speeds of approximately 5.5 knots. Steering remained intuitive. A rudder mechanically linked to the steering wheel allowed operators to navigate on water much as they would on land. Major General Jacob Devers witnessed an early demonstration in June 1942. Recognizing the vehicle's potential immediately, he authorized full-scale production. The initial order called for 2,000 units, but demand quickly escalated. By the end of the war, General Motors had produced 21,147 DUKWs, reaching peak output rates of 525 vehicles per month. Each unit cost $10,750, roughly the price of 7 Jeeps, yet delivered a capability that conventional vehicles could not match. As March 1945 approached, Germany's defensive posture along the Rhine River was far weaker than its commanders were willing to admit. The 1st Parachute Army, once among the most formidable formations in the West, had been devastated during the Reichswald battles. Approximately 90,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Units assigned to defend the Rhine were increasingly composed of Volkssturm formations. Elderly men and teenage boys with minimal training, armed with captured weapons and identified by armbands rather than standard uniforms. A letter written on March 20, 1945, by Feldwebel Otto Kraus of the 181st Infantry Division reflects the prevailing German mindset. Stationed near Wesel, he described hearing American vehicles moving constantly across the river. Yet he expressed confidence that the Rhine itself provided absolute security. History, doctrine, and engineering all reinforced that belief. Napoleon, he noted, had failed to force a contested crossing. On paper, the German defenses appeared formidable. Since September 1944, more than 200,000 civilian laborers had been compelled to reinforce the West Wall and extend fortifications toward the river. Approximately 3,000 concrete bunkers and firing positions had been newly constructed or upgraded. German military doctrine regarded the Rhine as the ideal natural barrier, too wide for temporary bridges, too fast for conventional boats, and too deep to be crossed by vehicles. What German planners failed to recognize was that the problem they believed unsolvable had already been answered. Not with massive bridges or heroic assaults, but with an unassuming amphibious truck born from a sandbar incident on the American coast. After the removal of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt from command in the West, responsibility for defending Germany's western frontier fell to Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. The operational directives issued under his authority made clear how the German High Command interpreted the coming Allied assault. Planners believed that any opposing force attempting to cross the Rhine would need 2 to 3 days to create bridgeheads sturdy enough to support sustained operations. This assumed delay, they believed, would open a decisive window in which German armored reserves could strike back and throw the attackers into the river. In reality, those reserves were thin. The principal mobile formation available was the 47th Panzer Corps, fielding roughly 150 serviceable armored fighting vehicles in total. Tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers together were expected to defend a sector stretching close to 200 kilometers. The imbalance between task and resources was severe, but the deeper flaw in German planning lay elsewhere. German operational thinking, shaped by years of earlier campaigns, treated major river crossings as a rigid sequence of steps. First came artillery fire to pin defenders. Infantry would then be ferried across in small boats to seize limited footholds. Engineers would follow, attempting to erect bridges under hostile fire. Only after these bridges were completed would heavy forces, especially armor, be committed. Each stage unfolded in order, and each stage offered defenders time to regroup, concentrate fire, and counterattack. What German intelligence failed to detect was that the Allies were preparing to bypass this entire sequence. Along the western bank of the Rhine, they had quietly assembled the largest mass of amphibious vehicles ever gathered for a single operation. By 22 March 1945, several hundred DUKW amphibious trucks were hidden in wooded areas and villages within a few miles of their designated crossing sites. Every vehicle had been sealed against water, thoroughly tested, and loaded according to carefully calculated cargo plans to preserve balance and buoyancy in fast-moving currents. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, commander of the 458th Amphibious Truck Company, later emphasized how deliberate the preparations had been. This was not a landing against surf and tides, he recalled, but a technical problem of river speed, exit gradients, and precise coordination with supporting artillery to prevent friendly fire. Crews trained for 2 full weeks on the Moselle River, learning how the DUKWs behaved in strong currents and under simulated combat conditions. The vehicles themselves reflected years of adaptation. Experience from earlier amphibious operations had led to the addition of armor plating around driver positions and critical mechanical systems. Circular mounts allowed heavy .5 caliber machine guns to be fitted for self-protection. Most important of all were upgraded bilge pumps, powerful enough to keep the vehicles afloat even when their hulls were punctured by rifle or machine gun fire. Damage no longer meant immediate loss of the vehicle or its passengers. Captain James Mitchell of the 819th Amphibious Truck Company remembered the tone of the final orders issued before the crossing. The crews were told they were about to attempt something unprecedented. Amphibious trucks would not merely support the operation or deliver supplies after bridges were in place, they would form the leading wave. Each DUKW would carry a complete infantry squad with full equipment, cross the Rhine under fire, climb directly onto the eastern bank, and unload soldiers straight into combat positions. British forces prepared a parallel effort. Major General Percy Hobart's 79th Armored Division brought with it some 600 Buffalo LVT-4 amphibious tractors, each capable of transporting around 30 troops. These tracked vehicles would operate alongside the American Ducks, together forming what would become the largest amphibious river assault ever conducted. Yet it was the wheeled Ducks, able to shift instantly from waterborne movement to land maneuver, that most decisively shattered German expectations. At 5 p.m. on 23 March 1945, the opening signal was given. An immense artillery barrage erupted along the Rhine front. More than 4,000 Allied guns, ranging from British 25-pounders to massive 240mm howitzers, fired in a coordinated bombardment that lasted 4 hours. Shells fell so densely that the boundary between sound and motion seemed to vanish. The air itself appeared solid with steel and flame. German troops watching from the eastern bank struggled to comprehend the scale of the fire. Observation posts reported that the ground seemed to churn and bubble beneath the constant impacts. One observer, Gerrit Heinrich Müller, later described attempting to count the gun flashes across the river before abandoning the effort at 500. To him, the horizon had become an unbroken ribbon of fire, stretching endlessly north and south, accompanied not by separate detonations, but by a single, overwhelming roar that drowned out all thought. Under the protection of an intense artillery barrage and the concealment provided by nightfall, the first amphibious vehicles began their movement toward the Rhine shortly after 9 p.m. The opening assault was carried out by the 51st Highland Division, with the 7th Battalion of the Black Watch embarking aboard Ducks crewed by American personnel. Each of these amphibious trucks transported a dozen fully armed infantrymen in addition to its 2-man crew. To avoid detection, navigation lights were masked so they could only be seen from the rear, discreetly indicating access and exit points along both riverbanks. One of the soldiers involved, Sergeant Robert McPhersonson of the Black Watch, later recalled the surreal transition from land to water. The vehicle descended the embankment and, without pause, began floating. The driver continued forward as if nothing had changed, though the Rhine was racing past the hull. The noise of the engine was overwhelming, and while German artillery rounds splashed into the river nearby, visibility was nearly non-existent due to darkness and smoke. Planners had underestimated the strength of the current, which reached speeds of 8 to 10 knots in the river's central channel. To compensate, the ducks entered the water well upstream of their designated landing zones. Their drivers calculated drift in much the same way pilots account for crosswinds. Some vehicles were carried far beyond their intended exit points, yet this posed little obstacle. The trucks were capable of climbing almost any manageable slope, allowing them to leave the river wherever conditions permitted. By 10 p.m., the initial assault wave had successfully reached the eastern bank. German troops, anticipating the sound of assault craft returning to collect additional waves, instead heard only the sustained thunder of Allied artillery. The amphibious vehicles had already surged up the riverbank and vanished inland. Their infantry passengers were now attacking German positions from directions the defenders had never anticipated. As daylight emerged on March 24, German command posts began receiving reports that seemed impossible. Allied troops were appearing several miles inland in full battalion strength, complete with heavy weapons and supplies. The familiar pattern of limited bridgeheads slowly expanding outward had not occurred. Instead, Allied formations appeared scattered deep behind German lines almost simultaneously. One particularly alarming report came from Hauptmann Karl Richet, who commanded an 88mm gun battery positioned to cover the Rhine crossing near Ries. His message to divisional headquarters stated bluntly that enemy armored forces were already behind his position. With all bridges destroyed and no signs of pontoon construction observed, German officers could not comprehend how this penetration had occurred. What the Germans were encountering were not tanks, but DUKWs, transporting mortars, machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and infantry support equipment. These vehicles had driven directly from the river to locations several miles inland. Their amphibious and off-road mobility allowed them to bypass fortified defensive positions designed to block predictable exits from the riverbank. As the morning fog lifted, the true scale of the operation became visible. Hundreds of DUKWs were moving back and forth across the Rhine in uninterrupted flows. Unlike traditional assault boats, which depended on engineer units and were confined to fixed crossing points, these amphibious trucks could enter and leave the water at virtually any suitable bank. German artillery observers reported swimming trucks crossing the river at dozens of locations along a front stretching more than 20 miles. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, operations officer of the 185th Infantry Division, noted in his diary that German defensive planning had assumed a small number of crossings that could be suppressed with concentrated fire. Instead, Allied forces were crossing everywhere at once, overwhelming artillery units that could not engage so many dispersed targets simultaneously. Further south, near Wesel, the British Second Army executed a similarly devastating assault using a combination of ducks and Buffalo LVTs. Infantry of the 15th Scottish Division crossed the Rhine aboard Buffaloes, while ducks delivered artillery, ammunition, and logistical supplies, ensuring that troops arrived fully equipped from the outset. By 8 a.m., despite determined resistance from the German 1st Parachute Army, 3 Allied divisions had completed the crossing with their full complement of equipment intact. 2 hours later, a new element entered the battle. The roar of aircraft engines filled the sky as Operation Varsity commenced, the largest airborne operation conducted in a single day. Over 1,700 transport aircraft and more than 1,350 gliders delivered approximately 16,000 airborne troops across the Rhine. Contrary to German expectations, this airborne assault was not an isolated deep strike. It was a carefully synchronized blow designed to reinforce and exploit the river crossing. Units of the U.S. 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division landed within artillery range of the Rhine, just a few miles from the amphibious forces. German officers observing the sky initially believed the paratrooper landings marked the main offensive and that the river crossings were merely diversions. One officer from the 84th Infantry Division later recalled watching the sky darken as parachutes filled the air in staggering numbers. Only afterward did they realize that American forces, supported by amphibious vehicles, were already advancing 10 kilometers behind German lines. This close coordination between airborne and amphibious forces represented a fundamental shift from earlier operations. Rather than operating independently far behind enemy territory, the airborne troops directly supported the river assault. Ducks delivered ammunition, medical supplies, and heavy equipment straight to airborne units, tasks that previously required risky aerial resupply or delayed ground link-ups. In the days that followed, wounded paratroopers were evacuated across the Rhine aboard returning ducks, a logistical achievement that would have been unthinkable in earlier airborne campaigns. Private First Class Donald Burgett of the 17th Airborne Division later recalled a moment that captured the strangeness of the Rhine crossing better than any official report. His unit was engaged in a bitter fight for a key road junction when an unexpected sight emerged from the tree line. Amphibious trucks, vehicles no one on the front line had been told to expect, rolled calmly toward them. There was no spray of water, no sign of engines struggling in mud. They moved like ordinary supply trucks, except for one detail that stunned everyone watching. Moments earlier, they had been in the river. As the vehicles reached friendly positions, one crewman leaned out and shouted a question that sounded almost absurd under fire. Did anyone need ammunition? For a split second, Burgett and others wondered whether exhaustion had finally pushed them into hallucination. By midday on March 24, German commanders were beginning to grasp the scale of what was happening along the Rhine. This was not simply an innovative method for ferrying troops across water. It represented a fundamental shift in amphibious warfare, one that quietly dismantled every assumption upon which German river defense doctrine had been built. Conventional crossings followed a rigid and predictable pattern. Infantry first forced their way across under fire. Engineers then secured a bridgehead. Temporary bridges were constructed. Only afterward could heavy equipment and sustained supplies begin to flow. Each step exposed attackers to counterattacks, artillery strikes, and air raids. Once a bridge existed, it became an obvious and lucrative target. The widespread deployment of the ducks eliminated this entire sequence. There were no bridges to defend, no bottlenecks to exploit, and no pause between assault and resupply. Lieutenant Colonel George Sims, serving as a logistics officer with the U.S. 16th Corps, organized what he described as duck highways spanning the Rhine. On the western bank, amphibious trucks were loaded with fuel, food, medical equipment, ammunition, or troops. Instead of stopping at the river's edge, they simply drove into it, crossed under their own power, climbed onto the eastern shore, and proceeded directly to frontline units. Supplies were delivered without unloading, vehicle transfers, or delays for engineering work. At Sims's primary crossing site, traffic reached extraordinary levels. Roughly 50 ducks were moving across every hour, day and night. Each vehicle carried either 2.5 tons of cargo or approximately 25 soldiers. Over the course of a single hour, that amounted to more than 100 tons of supplies or well over 1,000 troops. German reconnaissance aircraft searched in vain for bridges to bomb. There were none, only trucks moving steadily through the water. The effect on German morale was severe. Hermann Goertz, a field corporal with the 2nd Parachute Regiment, wrote in his diary that the enemy appeared to possess an endless supply of vehicles capable of swimming. He questioned how any defensive line could hold when rivers themselves had ceased to function as obstacles. Bridges were being demolished as planned, yet the effort was meaningless. The Americans no longer needed them. Accounts from Allied supply personnel further illustrated the surreal nature of the operation. Technical Sergeant Anthony Russo of the 30th Infantry Division described establishing a supply point several miles beyond the Rhine. While still under combat conditions, a DUKW arrived directly from the river, water streaming from its hull. Inside were insulated containers holding freshly prepared meals. Cooks on the western bank had loaded hot food and coffee into the vehicle, which then drove straight into an active combat zone. Russo later remarked that the sight must have convinced German troops that their opponents were either reckless or insane. By the morning of March 25th, German leadership faced a scenario for which Wehrmacht manuals offered no guidance. For centuries, the Rhine had been treated as Germany's natural defensive shield. Now it had not been stormed or breached in the traditional sense. It had simply been rendered irrelevant by Allied industrial capability and logistical imagination, something German intelligence had previously dismissed as a novelty. General Alfred Schlemm, commanding the 1st Parachute Army, convened an emergency meeting at a farmhouse near Brunnen. Later testimony from captured officers provides insight into the atmosphere of the discussion. Schlemm reportedly told his subordinates that they had prepared to defend against familiar methods of attack. Instead, the enemy had bypassed the fortress entirely. The statistics were sobering. In just the first 2 days, more than 15,000 Allied troops had crossed the Rhine aboard DUKWs. Even more alarming was the movement of equipment. Over 1,200 vehicles, including jeeps, trucks, and light armored units, were already operating east of the river, assets that traditional crossing techniques would have required days to deliver. Artillery pieces were being supplied and firing from the eastern bank before German intelligence had fully confirmed the crossings. Oberst Heinrich von Ludechow, commanding what remained of Panzer Brigade 106, attempted a counterattack near Wessel on March 25th. His unit's war diary recorded the failure in blunt terms. The brigade advanced toward what it expected to be a concentrated bridgehead. Instead, it found Allied forces spread across a wide front, continuously reinforced by amphibious vehicles arriving at multiple points. With no central target to strike and no bridges to destroy, the attack collapsed under heavy losses. British forces experienced comparable success. Scottish divisions advanced several miles inland within a day, sustained by uninterrupted DUWK supply operations. Royal Artillery observers frequently remained aboard the vehicles while directing fire, using their mobility to evade German counter-battery efforts. The Rhine crossing exposed a deeper imbalance between the opposing war economies. German engineers had produced their own amphibious transport, the Land Wasserschlepper. Technically, it was an impressive machine. It offered better protection, used tracks for superior performance in difficult terrain, and incorporated sophisticated waterproofing systems. From a purely engineering standpoint, it rivaled or surpassed the DUWK. Yet the numbers told a different story. Fewer than 100 Land Wasserschleppers were ever built, and only a small fraction saw combat. Each required specialized parts, highly trained labor, and scarce materials. The cost was immense, roughly 7 times that of an American DUWK. In contrast, U.S. industry, led by General Motors, produced over 21,000 DUWKs. The vehicle was deliberately designed to share engines, transmissions, axles, and countless components with the standard CCKW truck, of which more than 500,000 were manufactured. What Germany achieved through craftsmanship, the United States multiplied through standardization. At the Rhine, that difference proved decisive. The river that had shaped centuries of European warfare became almost overnight just another road. The DUWK and the collapse of the Rhine barrier. One of the most decisive strengths of the American DUWK lay not in its novelty, but in its simplicity. Because it was built on the same mechanical foundations as standard U.S. military trucks, virtually any Army mechanic could service it without special retraining. Replacement components were widely available, and when proper parts were missing, crews improvised using ordinary truck equipment. Vehicles damaged beyond repair were stripped for usable components and returned to service indirectly. Master Sergeant Edwin Coleman, The senior maintenance officer of the 462nd Amphibious Truck Company later described this flexibility as a critical advantage. According to him, nearly 9 out of 10 DUKWs assigned to the Rhine operation remained functional throughout the crossing. When a breakdown occurred, repairs were usually immediate. If a part was unavailable, crews modified whatever they could find from conventional transport vehicles. He contrasted this approach with German engineering, which relied on complex, highly specialized machines that were difficult to repair outside factory conditions. This difference reflected a deeper contrast in industrial philosophy. American planners assumed that most operators would be temporary soldiers, civilians turned servicemen with limited training time. As a result, the DUKW was designed to be learned quickly. Any driver familiar with a standard truck could master its amphibious controls in a matter of hours. German military vehicles, by contrast, were built for career soldiers and required extensive technical instruction. Efficiency through standardization defined American production. Precision through specialization defined German design. Personal testimonies from both Allied and German participants reveal how transformative this shift was at the human level. These were not abstract theories of logistics or manufacturing, but lived experiences of young men witnessing warfare change before their eyes. Private First Class James H., serving with the 89th Infantry Division, later recalled his astonishment on the western bank of the Rhine. His unit had prepared for a dangerous river assault, expecting to board small boats under enemy fire, just as they had practiced. Instead, massive amphibious trucks rolled down the embankment toward them. A sailor, an American Navy sailor no less, motioned them aboard. Confused, James asked what kind of vehicle it was. The sailor smiled and replied that it was their ride straight into Germany. The idea of naval personnel operating vehicles deep inside the European continent seemed almost surreal. This unexpected naval presence had an equally disorienting effect on German troops. Seaman Second Class Robert Moody, assigned to a naval detachment operating DUKWs during the Rhine crossing, described capturing enemy soldiers who were visibly shaken by what they saw. One German, fluent in English, repeatedly asked how the U.S. Navy could possibly be there when the sea was hundreds of miles away. The scene defied everything he had been taught to expect. German letters and interrogation reports show a growing sense of hopelessness as the scale of Allied amphibious capability became undeniable. Lieutenant Frederick Schulzer of the 338th Infantry Division wrote in a letter later recovered after his capture that the Americans did not cross the river cautiously or secretly. They moved across it as if it were an ordinary road. Trucks carrying soldiers drove straight through the water while German units fired at them, only to see more vehicles appear without pause. The sheer volume of traffic left defenders wondering how such numbers were even possible. Another German soldier, Private Paul Brown, captured on March 26th, admitted during questioning that his unit had prepared for an entirely different scenario. They had been assured the Rhine would delay the Allies for weeks. They expected bridge construction that could be targeted by artillery and small boats that could be destroyed easily. No one had mentioned vehicles that could swim. No one had warned them that the river could be crossed almost anywhere without warning. In his words, they had trained for a war that no longer existed. By the morning of March 26, 1945, only 3 days after the first ducks entered the Rhine, the German defensive system along the river had ceased to function. What German doctrine predicted would require weeks of resistance collapsed in just 72 hours. The Rhine, long promoted by propaganda as the Reich's final natural shield, had simply vanished as an obstacle. Operational data from those 3 days illustrates the magnitude of the breakthrough. Ducks completed more than 5,000 individual river transits. They carried 15,000 soldiers across the water, transported over 1,200 vehicles, delivered 3,000 tons of supplies, and evacuated roughly 2,000 wounded personnel. Achieving a similar level of throughput using traditional bridging methods would have taken at least 2 weeks, and that under constant enemy fire. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, often criticized for being overly cautious, achieved total operational surprise through the large-scale deployment of amphibious trucks. In his post-operation report, he observed that while the enemy fully expected a Rhine crossing, they had not anticipated driving vehicles across it. That misunderstanding, he noted, proved fatal to German defenses. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower visited the crossing area on March 26. His reaction, recorded by his aide, Captain Harry Butcher, captured the strategic significance of what he witnessed. Eisenhower watched ducks moving continuously across the river, back and forth, like a civilian ferry system. He remarked that with such vehicles, every river in Germany had effectively become a usable road. General Omar Bradley replied that the Germans were only beginning to grasp that reality. The psychological impact was devastating. Joseph Goebbels, in his diary entry dated March 26, acknowledged the hopelessness of the situation in the West. He wrote that Allied forces had crossed the Rhine along a wide front using an amphibious vehicle Germany had failed to foresee. With the loss of the final natural defensive line, he concluded, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. On March 27, the Allies fully exploited the breach. With German units fragmented and disorganized, armored and mechanized forces surged forward. The Ducks, having completed their river crossing role, transitioned seamlessly into conventional logistics vehicles. They advanced alongside tank formations, no longer as amphibians, but as high-speed supply trucks. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, known as Hell on Wheels, crossed the Rhine faster than any comparable force in previous operations. Tank crews described the strange sight of ducks, still dripping with river water, speeding ahead of them on German highways. These vehicles delivered fuel and ammunition directly to advancing units, eliminating the usual operational pause required to consolidate supplies after a river assault. Major General Isaac White, commanding the 2nd Armored Division, reported that his forces advanced nearly 50 miles on March 27 alone. Under normal circumstances, such momentum would have been impossible. Bridges would need to be completed, supply depots established, and lines secured. Instead, the Ducks kept pace with the advance. They crossed additional rivers as they were encountered, identified new crossing points, and established forward supply nodes before the main force arrived. German resistance dissolved into scattered pockets. Units that had prepared to counterattack bridgeheads found themselves bypassed entirely by Allied columns that appeared to be operating everywhere at once. The war in Western Germany had entered its final phase, accelerated not by a single weapon, but by a system, one built on adaptability, mass production, and the ability to turn rivers from barriers into highways. Amphibious warfare and the collapse of a defensive paradigm. German defensive planning along major rivers rested on a rigid assumption. Any large-scale crossing would inevitably funnel attacking forces toward a limited number of identifiable sites. These choke points, bridges, ferries, and prepared fords were expected to become killing zones, destroyed or neutralized before an enemy could establish momentum. What this doctrine failed to anticipate was an entirely different approach to river warfare, one in which the river ceased to be a fixed obstacle at all. The mass deployment of Allied amphibious vehicles, particularly the DUKW, rendered this defensive logic obsolete. Rather than converging on pre-existing crossings, hundreds of amphibious trucks simply created crossings wherever terrain allowed. German planners had no practical response to a force that could enter the water at will, disperse across miles of frontage, and emerge unpredictably on the far bank. This reality became painfully clear to Oberst Hans von Luck, one of the Wehrmacht's most seasoned armored commanders. On March 28, near the town of Dorsten, his unit rushed forward in an attempt to form a blocking line against what intelligence had described as a delayed Allied advance. Instead, his battalion collided with American infantry that was already entrenched and prepared. According to von Luck's post-war memoirs, the encounter was deeply unsettling. Seeking to understand how the enemy had arrived ahead of him, he questioned a captured American lieutenant. The officer gestured toward a column of amphibious trucks lining the riverbank and responded simply, "We don't stop for bridges." Von Luck later reflected that this exchange marked a turning point in his understanding of the war. Germany, he realized, had not merely lost a tactical engagement, it had fallen behind an entirely new operational concept. The true significance of the DUKW during the Rhine crossing cannot be measured solely by tonnage or vehicle counts, impressive though those figures were. What mattered far more was the way these vehicles transformed the underlying mathematics of river assault. Their impact multiplied over time, creating advantages that reinforced one another across logistics, maneuver, fire support, and medical evacuation. Traditional river crossings forced attackers to concentrate troops and equipment at narrow entry points. This concentration made them vulnerable to artillery barrages and airstrikes. By contrast, amphibious trucks allowed Allied forces to spread their crossings across vast stretches of the river. German firepower, designed to destroy dense targets, was suddenly diluted and misdirected. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized rapid counterattacks against bridgeheads before they could be expanded. But during the Rhine operation, there were no classic bridgeheads to counterattack. Instead, German units faced a steady, continuous flow of Allied troops infiltrating across the entire front, leaving no single focal point to strike. Colonel William Thompson, responsible for coordinating DUK operations within the U.S. Ninth Army, later quantified the operational advantage. Under combat conditions, constructing a heavy pontoon bridge typically required at least half a day, and often a full day or more. During that time, reinforcements could cross only in small boats, at best a company per hour. With DUKs, however, battalion-sized forces were moving across the river from the opening moments of the assault, radically compressing the timeline of buildup. One of the most consequential but frequently overlooked effects of this system was its impact on battlefield medicine. Captain Dorothy Anderson, serving with the 45th Field Hospital, described how amphibious vehicles reshaped casualty evacuation. Wounded soldiers were loaded directly onto DUKs on the eastern bank and driven straight to surgical facilities on the western side. The absence of transfers, delays, or bridge dependencies meant that many casualties reached operating tables within 60 minutes of injury, a speed unheard of in earlier river assaults. Beyond logistics and evacuation, DUKs enabled a series of tactical adaptations that German defenders were unprepared to counter. Artillery forward observers used the vehicles to reposition rapidly, rendering counter-battery fire ineffective. Engineers transported bridge components by water, paradoxically speeding up conventional bridge construction, even as amphibious traffic made such bridges less essential. Mobile radio relay stations mounted on DUKs maintained uninterrupted communications across the river, neutralizing the Rhine as a communications barrier. In the aftermath of the campaign, captured documents and post-war testimonies revealed the depth of German intelligence failure. The Wehrmacht had observed amphibious trucks in multiple theaters – Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy – yet consistently misunderstood their strategic significance. Major General Reinhard Gehlen, later head of West Germany's intelligence service, admitted that while American equipment was carefully catalogued, its doctrinal implications were never fully grasped. German analysts assumed that Allied production limits mirrored their own. Because Germany could only field amphibious vehicles in small numbers, they concluded that the Allies faced similar constraints. This assumption proved disastrous. A February 1945 intelligence estimate by Army Group H suggested that Allied forces possessed no more than 150 amphibious vehicles suitable for river crossings. In reality, the 21st Army Group alone controlled more than 2,000. Other reports dismissed the DUK as a post-landing supply vehicle unsuitable for assault operations. German intelligence failed to identify dedicated amphibious truck units, overlooked large-scale training exercises, and missed the emergence of a fundamentally new operational doctrine. Major Joachim Engelmann, intelligence officer for the 1st Parachute Army, later summarized the failure bluntly. He explained that German analysts had studied every Allied river crossing from Italy to France and believed they understood Allied methods. The large-scale use of amphibious vehicles, however, lay entirely outside their analytical framework.
comparable, he said, to an enemy suddenly acquiring the ability to fly armored units across a river.
Despite the technological and operational advantages demonstrated at the Rhine, the crossing was far from bloodless. The human cost, while significantly lower than that of traditional assault methods, remained substantial. Combined casualties for Operations Plunder and Varsity reached 6,781, nearly 4,000 British and Commonwealth troops and over 2,800 Americans. Airborne units suffered particularly heavy losses from concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The U.S. 17th Airborne Division alone recorded 430 killed in action in a single day. Amphibious vehicles themselves were not immune. Several DUKWs evacuating wounded were struck by German artillery, resulting in the loss of entire crews and passengers. Oscar Frieden's son, a combat engineer with the U.S. 89th Infantry Division, recalled his unit's crossing near St. Goarshausen on March 26. Of the 420 men assigned to his sector, nearly 250 became casualties while attempting to secure the high ground. Speed, he noted, did not confer invulnerability. German machine guns and mortars exacted a brutal toll. German losses, however, were catastrophic. The 1st Parachute Army effectively disintegrated as a fighting force. Within the first 3 days, more than 16,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Many units abandoned their positions once it became clear that the Rhine could no longer function as a defensive barrier. Others were cut off entirely as Allied forces, transported by DUWKs, appeared unexpectedly in their rear areas. Gefreiter Vera Hoffmann of the German 84th Infantry Division was captured on March 25. During interrogation, he described the profound psychological impact of the crossing. After 2 days of firing on expected crossing points, American troops suddenly emerged behind his unit. When questioned, captured Americans pointed to the amphibious trucks. Hoffman recalled a lieutenant throwing down his weapon and declaring that if the enemy could drive trucks across the Rhine, the war was finished. No one argued. One of the most symbolic moments of the operation occurred that same day when British Prime Minister Winston Churchill insisted on crossing the Rhine himself. This was not a mere publicity gesture. Churchill recognized the immense historical weight of Allied armies breaching what many Germans regarded as their most sacred natural defense. After observing the crossings from the ruins of a railway bridge near Wesel alongside Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and General Alan Brooke, Churchill ignored urgent warnings from his security staff and direct objections from General Eisenhower. He boarded an American LCVP and crossed to the eastern bank. Montgomery's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Trumbull Warren, later described the scene. Churchill was unwavering. "I have waited years for this moment," he declared. The American crew, initially unaware of their passenger's identity, were stunned when they realized who was aboard. Churchill, unfazed, stood with cigar in hand, flashing victory signs as the landing craft cut across the river, an unmistakable symbol of a war that had decisively turned. For roughly half an hour in March 1945, the British Prime Minister placed himself in a situation few civilian leaders would have dared. Standing on the eastern bank of the Rhine, on territory that had been German soil only days before, Winston Churchill calmly observed the unfolding Allied advance while enemy artillery still ranged nearby. Shells struck close enough to scatter dirt and fragments across his party. According to witnesses, Churchill bent down, scooped up a clump of earth, and quietly remarked on its significance. It was no longer symbolic ground, it was conquered ground. From a strictly military standpoint, Churchill's crossing was unnecessary and carried real risk. Yet its value lay elsewhere. It sent an unmistakable psychological message. The barrier Germany had long believed impregnable had been breached, and the leaders of the Allied powers could now stand openly beyond it. This moment was made possible not by a single bridge or a pause in combat traffic, but by the constant movement of amphibious vehicles, ducks, and landing craft that flowed back and forth across the river without interruption. Under conventional engineering doctrine, such a crossing would have required halting vital troop and supply movements on a limited number of bridges. The decentralized, amphibious nature of the operation removed that constraint entirely. Post-war assessments concluded that the Rhine crossing hastened the end of the war in Europe by approximately 3 weeks. This acceleration did not stem merely from the fact that Allied forces crossed the river, but from how they did so. Amphibious logistics enabled speed, scale, and simultaneity on a level German planners had not anticipated. Traditional river crossing doctrine envisioned a slow and dangerous progression. Small assault forces securing narrow footholds, engineers constructing bridges under fire, supplies trickling across, and only then a breakout once sufficient strength had accumulated. Even if executed flawlessly, such an operation would have taken weeks. During that time, German forces could have reorganized, established fallback defensive lines, sabotaged infrastructure, and prolonged resistance, perhaps long enough to alter political outcomes. Instead, the Allies achieved in 3 days what German staff officers believed would require several weeks. By March 26th, 3 Allied armies were driving rapidly into the German interior. The Ruhr region, the industrial core of the Reich, was soon encircled. By early April, the pace of the advance denied German forces the opportunity to systematically destroy factories, bridges, and supply depots that might have sustained further fighting. General Omar Bradley later reflected on the human cost that had been avoided. Had the Rhine been crossed using assault boats, exposed engineers, and incremental reinforcement, he estimated casualties would have exceeded 50,000 men. The widespread use of ducks transformed what should have been a catastrophic bloodletting into a massive logistical operation conducted under fire but at unprecedented efficiency. The effects of the crossing extended far beyond the Western Front. Soviet commanders, informed of the speed and success of the Allied advance, pushed their own forces forward more aggressively toward Berlin. They were determined that the Western Allies would not reach the Nazi capital first. The political competition that would define post-war Europe was intensified by the events on the Rhine. By March 28, 1945, the German command structure in the West was collapsing. Communications between units deteriorated as headquarters were overrun or forced to withdraw in haste. The tempo of the Allied advance, enabled by the rapid crossing of the Rhine, made any coordinated defense impossible. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, found his forces fragmented and encircled in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. On March 29th, Model issued what would be his final order. It acknowledged the hopelessness of the situation and urged soldiers to save themselves rather than continue futile resistance. Less than a month later, on April 21st, he took his own life rather than surrender. His decision reflected the broader psychological breakdown occurring across German forces. Units that had previously defended every town and village with determination now surrendered by the tens of thousands. The Rhine had long occupied a near-mythical place in German strategic thinking, a natural shield believed to guarantee security. Once it fell so quickly, the illusion of protection vanished. Any notion of sustained resistance, including plans for guerrilla warfare, largely evaporated. Civilian morale, already battered by years of bombing and deprivation, collapsed entirely. The crossing demonstrated with brutal clarity that no natural obstacle could shield Germany from defeat. If the Rhine, revered for centuries as a defensive boundary, could be overcome in 72 hours, the logic of continued fighting dissolved. Across Western Germany, local officials began negotiating the surrender of their towns to avoid unnecessary destruction. The sense of finality was captured even within the Nazi leadership. Hans Frank, the former governor-general of occupied Poland, recorded in his diary that the crossing of the Rhine erased any remaining doubt about Germany's fate. What lay ahead, he believed, was not simply defeat, but total ruin. Beyond its immediate wartime consequences, the Rhine crossing reshaped military theory. Before 1945, large-scale amphibious assaults were associated almost exclusively with coastal landings, Normandy, Sicily, or the island campaigns of the Pacific. The Rhine proved that amphibious capability could be equally decisive deep within a continent. Official U.S. Army histories later described the mass deployment of DUKWs at the Rhine as a transformation in warfare comparable to the introduction of tanks during the First World War. Rivers were no longer obstacles to be overcome, they became corridors of movement. Observers from the Soviet Union took careful note. One attached officer reported to Moscow that the Americans had effectively neutralized rivers through industrial-scale production of amphibious vehicles. With sufficient numbers, water barriers ceased to matter, a lesson with profound implications for future European conflicts. The British Army, despite its direct participation, reached similar conclusions through its own post-war studies. Senior officers warned against ever again assuming that rivers offered meaningful defensive protection against a technologically prepared enemy. The Rhine crossing demonstrated that industrial capacity could outweigh geography itself. Although commanders and planners received much of the credit, many historians have argued that the true enablers of victory were the crews of the amphibious vehicles. Often drawn from U.S. Navy detachments, these men operated slow, lightly protected machines under constant threat, effectively serving as floating targets. Yet they kept moving, ferrying troops, vehicles, and supplies across one of Europe's great rivers at the very moment it mattered most. Their work turned a centuries-old defensive line into little more than another route forward, and in doing so, helped bring the war in Europe to its decisive conclusion. Crossing a wide river under fire is not a maneuver taught easily in manuals. Imagine guiding a large, sluggish vehicle across more than a quarter-mile of exposed water with no meaningful cover. The current pulls relentlessly, limiting any attempt at evasive movement. Enemy machine guns probe constantly, searching for distance and rhythm. Mortar shells strike the water nearby, sending columns of spray skyward. German 88mm guns loom in the distance, their crews well-trained and fully aware of what a floating truck represents. In such moments, the driver has few choices. Hold the wheel steady, keep the engine at full power, and hope survival follows momentum. What made these crossings possible was not just courage at the wheel, but relentless labor behind the scenes. Maintenance teams attached to the U.S. amphibious truck companies achieved feats that bordered on the impossible. Working at night, often under direct enemy fire and without proper shelter, they kept the DUKWs operational despite damage that would normally sideline a vehicle permanently. Hulls punctured by shrapnel were sealed on the spot. Propellers twisted by submerged debris were swapped out in darkness. Engines drenched repeatedly in river water were coaxed back to life again and again. Master Sergeant Thomas Riley of the 458th Amphibious Truck Company later described the improvisation involved. There was no time for ideal repairs. Holes were covered with whatever materials could be scavenged: flattened food tins, fragments of captured German steel, even carved wooden plugs. If the vehicle could float and its engine could turn, it went back into service. Perfection was irrelevant. Movement was everything. British units operating DUKWs, trained initially by American instructors, quickly adapted the vehicles to their own tactical needs. One notable innovation came from Sergeant Major William Davies of the Royal Army Service Corps. He developed a method for using amphibious trucks as mobile rescue platforms for armored units. When tanks were disabled and set ablaze near waterways, DUKWs would approach directly, positioning themselves between enemy fire and the wreck. Crews pulled injured tankers aboard, while water streaming off the hull helped reduce the heat from burning fuel and metal. According to Davies, this method saved dozens of lives that would otherwise have been lost within minutes.
In the years immediately following Germany's defeat, senior German officers undertook extensive studies to understand how their defenses had failed so completely. The crossing of the Rhine River emerged repeatedly as a central case study. What they found was not merely a failure of firepower or planning, but a profound misjudgment of enemy capability. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, reflected on this in a 1948 analysis. German forces, he wrote, had done everything required by doctrine. Artillery positions were carefully plotted, reserves were positioned, demolitions were prepared. Defensive logic had been followed precisely. What German planners never seriously considered was the possibility that the Allies could deploy hundreds of vehicles capable of treating the river as if it were irrelevant. An internal Wehrmacht report compiled in 1946 by captured officers reached an even starker conclusion. The mass use of amphibious trucks, it stated, represented a mode of warfare for which Germany had neither anticipation nor countermeasure. Even with prior knowledge, the report admitted, German industry lacked the capacity to produce such vehicles in comparable numbers. The defeat at the Rhine, therefore, had its origins not at the riverbank, but in the factories of the United States. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, widely regarded as the architect of German armored doctrine, offered a broader philosophical assessment. Germany, he argued, had refined warfare as a technical and tactical art. The Americans, by contrast, mastered warfare as an industrial enterprise. At the Rhine, industrial capacity outweighed elegance. The amphibious trucks were crude by German standards, unremarkable, unsophisticated, and lacking refinement, but they were available in overwhelming quantity. That imbalance proved decisive. Despite its importance, the role of the DUKW in the Rhine crossing rarely occupies center stage in popular histories. Dramatic episodes such as the capture of the Remagen Bridge, the airborne landings, or Montgomery's carefully choreographed assaults tend to dominate the narrative. Among those who were present, however, the significance of the amphibious trucks was never in doubt. General Dwight D. Eisenhower addressed this directly in his memoir, Crusade in Europe. He acknowledged that historians would long debate which factors shortened the war most: strategic bombing, pressure from the Soviet advance, or Allied cooperation. Yet, he argued, such debates often overlooked the quiet effectiveness of the DUKW. Without it, the Rhine could have become a catastrophic killing zone. With it, Allied forces crossed into Germany with astonishing speed and relatively limited loss. The DUKW service did not end at the Rhine. The same vehicles went on to cross the Elbe, the Danube, and countless smaller rivers. They transported supplies where bridges had been destroyed and roads no longer existed. They evacuated survivors from concentration camps who lacked the strength to walk. In devastated regions cut off by flooding or infrastructure collapse, amphibious trucks became lifelines for civilian populations. Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison of the 336th Amphibious Truck Company later recalled the surreal transition. The very DUKW that had carried ammunition across the Rhine under enemy fire was soon delivering food to German children in flood-stricken areas near Hamburg. To civilians, the vehicle seemed almost magical. Children ran alongside it, shouting nicknames that translated loosely to swimming truck, marveling at a machine that defied their expectations. In this way, a tool designed for destruction became an instrument of recovery. By the end of the war, 21,147 ducks had been produced. Their significance lay not only in their function, but in what they represented. American industry favored solutions that were sufficient rather than flawless, scalable rather than exquisite. German engineers pursued technical perfection in limited numbers. American factories pursued adequacy multiplied thousands of times over. This philosophy extended far beyond amphibious trucks. The same industrial network that produced ducks was turning out 2.5-ton cargo trucks by the tens of thousands each month. The steel used to patch battle damage came from mills launching Liberty ships at a rate of one every 42 hours. Engine assembly lines could pivot rapidly, producing power plants for trucks, tanks, or aircraft with minimal adjustment. Donald Nelson, chairman of the U.S. War Production Board, witnessed this system firsthand during a visit to a duck assembly line in 1944. In a single hour, he observed 6 vehicles completed. None would have impressed a German quality inspector. The welds were rough. The designs were simple. Everything was painted the same utilitarian olive drab, yet every one of them was capable of crossing the Rhine. Nelson later remarked that where German factories might spend weeks crafting a single perfect amphibious vehicle, American plants produced hundreds that were merely good enough. History would show that in this war, good enough, produced at scale, was more than enough. The contrast between German and American wartime production methods became unmistakably clear during the final Allied assault across the Rhine. Germany's reliance on limited, artisanal manufacturing proved to be a fatal weakness. Each German Landwasserschlepper, LWS, demanded highly trained specialists, individually fabricated parts, and prolonged calibration before deployment. This fragile system collapsed the moment Allied air raids disrupted supply lines. If even a single component failed to arrive, an entire vehicle remained unusable. Across the river, American production operated by an entirely different logic. The DUK program was designed with flexibility in mind. When shortages appeared, substitute components were installed without halting assembly. Production lines kept moving, and vehicles continued to roll out in large numbers. This adaptability would soon have consequences far beyond logistics.
The success of the Rhine crossing sent shockwaves through the collapsing German war effort. Units scattered across the Reich received the news almost simultaneously. The Western Allies had breached what was believed to be the final natural defense of Germany, and they had done so with startling speed. Troop morale, already under strain, disintegrated. In Italy, German formations that had stubbornly defended mountain strongholds for months abruptly abandoned their positions and retreated northward. Field Marshal Kessler recorded the psychological impact with grim clarity. He noted that soldiers openly questioned the purpose of continued resistance, asking how victory could be possible if the Rhine itself had failed to halt the enemy. He admitted he had no answer. Meanwhile, German forces stationed in Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, still armed and potentially dangerous, began to seek localized surrender agreements. The Rhine had long symbolized the possibility of a negotiated peace. Its collapse within 3 days erased that illusion. Even in Berlin, encircled by Soviet armies, the crossing of the Rhine resonated deeply. During his final documented military briefing on April 27th, Adolf Hitler lamented that German planners had never anticipated large-scale Allied amphibious operations on inland rivers. He conceded that preparations had been made for an outdated form of warfare, a rare moment of accurate strategic reflection in the final hours of the regime. Decades later, in 1985, veterans gathered in Lexington, Kentucky to commemorate the Rhine crossing. Many were elderly by then, but memories of those decisive days between March 23rd and March 26, 1945, remained vivid. Among the exhibits, preserved DUKWs attracted particular interest, standing as physical reminders of a turning point in modern warfare. Former Sergeant James Mitchell, once a DUKW commander in the 819th Amphibious Truck Company, stood beside one of the vehicles and remarked wryly on its appearance. He described it as an ungainly hybrid, neither proper boat nor proper truck, yet emphasized that this awkward machine had accomplished what German planners believed impossible. Victory, he explained, had not come from superior firepower or individual heroism, but from overwhelming production, creative engineering, and imagination. Among the attendees was Hans Müller, a former German military correspondent who had served with the 181st Infantry Division along the Rhine. Invited as a guest, his address to the veterans was strikingly candid. He recalled that German defenses were built to repel tanks, not amphibious cargo vehicles. The moment he witnessed those machines emerging from the river onto German soil, he understood that the conflict had reached its inevitable conclusion. The war, in his words, was not merely lost, it was finished. The reunion underscored a broader historical reality. The Rhine crossing was not a triumph of daring tactics or exceptional bravery alone. It was the product of industrial capacity harnessed through innovation. The true protagonists were not only the soldiers who crossed the river under fire, but also the factory workers in places like Pontiac, Michigan, who assembled the machines that made the operation possible. Between March 23 and March 31, 1945, the logistical achievements were extraordinary. Hundreds of DUKWs participated directly in the crossing, supported by approximately 600 British amphibious Buffalo vehicles. More than 2,000 DUKWs were available across the European theater. In contrast, Germany had produced only 100 LWS vehicles, and very few were operational at the critical moment. During that brief period, Allied forces transported over 15,000 troops across the Rhine, moved roughly 1,200 vehicles, delivered nearly 3,000 tons of supplies, evacuated 2,000 wounded soldiers, and completed more than 5,000 individual DUKW crossings. These numbers tell a story not of tactical brilliance, but of sustained logistical dominance. The disparity in production was even more revealing. The United States manufactured 21,147 DUKWs during the war, drawing from a pool of over 500,000 standardized trucks that shared components with the amphibious vehicle. Germany, constrained by specialization and scarcity, managed only about 100 LWS units. This philosophy unsettled the German military establishment. General von Rundstedt, speaking while in British captivity, criticized what he perceived as the industrialization of warfare. He argued that war had become the domain of factory administrators rather than generals, and that the Allies' amphibious trucks were industrial products rather than true weapons. Yet this transformation was precisely what sealed Germany's defeat. The DUKW symbolized an American approach to war. Problems were addressed not through perfection, but through scalability, not through elite craftsmanship, but through standardization. These vehicles were operated by citizen soldiers, trained quickly and efficiently, rather than lifelong professionals. What German officers viewed as crude, the Allies embraced as effective. In the end, the Rhine crossing represented more than a military success. It marked the victory of mass production over bespoke engineering, of flexible innovation over rigid doctrine, and of industrial democracy over military aristocracy. The DUWK was not the finest amphibious vehicle ever designed, but it was the best that could be built quickly, in vast numbers using existing technology. And that ultimately proved decisive. The Rhine crossing and the logic of industrial warfare. By early 1945, the German military possessed no vehicles purpose-built for large-scale amphibious river assault. Defensive planning relied heavily on the Rhine as a natural barrier, a line assumed to delay any Allied advance for weeks, if not months. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The United States, facing the same geographical challenge, did not seek an elegant or revolutionary weapon. Instead, it relied on speed, improvisation, and production capacity. From the initial concept of the DUWK amphibious truck to a functioning prototype, only 38 days elapsed. What followed was not a limited trial, but immediate mass deployment. When Allied forces reached the Rhine, operational planners estimated that breaching German defenses might require prolonged engagements. Instead, the crossing was completed in approximately 72 hours. Military historians later calculated that this acceleration shortened the European war by nearly 3 weeks and likely spared more than 50,000 Allied casualties. From an economic perspective, the contrast was equally stark.
A single American DUKW cost roughly $10,750 to produce. Its closest German equivalent, the Landwasserschlepper, required far greater resources and time, resulting in an approximate 7-to-1 cost disadvantage. Even more decisive than price was availability. The Americans fielded these vehicles in overwhelming numbers, while Germany lacked anything comparable at scale. The significance of the Duck extended far beyond its tactical role. The Rhine operation demonstrated that surprise in modern warfare did not require secrecy or exotic technology. It could arise from the sheer volume of tools the enemy had underestimated or dismissed as crude. This lesson reshaped military thinking after 1945. NATO doctrines during the Cold War emphasized rapid river crossing capabilities across Central and Eastern Europe's dense waterways. The Soviet Union, studying the Rhine operation closely, developed entire families of amphibious armored vehicles inspired by American success. Over time, river crossing capacity ceased to be a niche specialization and became a baseline requirement for modern armed forces. The implications were not limited to military theory. The Rhine crossing validated a distinctly American industrial philosophy that adequacy at scale could outperform perfection in isolation. Reliability outweighed refinement. Availability mattered more than elegance. Systems designed to be good enough, if produced in sufficient numbers, could overwhelm even the most meticulously engineered defenses. This mindset shaped post-war reconstruction and development. The Marshall Plan applied the same principle to Europe's recovery, favoring massive standardized aid over tailored slow-moving solutions. The U.S. interstate highway system translated wartime logistics into civilian infrastructure. Even the early space program prioritized components that could be manufactured reliably and repeatedly, rather than handcrafted masterpieces. Perhaps the most powerful impact of the Rhine crossing was psychological. For generations, the river had symbolized Germany's ultimate line of defense. In March 1945, German soldiers and civilians watched American forces treated as a minor obstacle. Post-war interviews reveal a common expectation among civilians living near the Rhine that the Allies would be stalled for a long period, allowing time for negotiations, counteroffensives, or rumored miracle weapons. Instead, within 3 days, American vehicles, unfamiliar, ungainly, and abundant, were moving eastward in uninterrupted streams. One resident near Wesel later recalled hearing relentless artillery on the night of March 23rd. She and her family prepared for weeks of fighting. By March 26th, American trucks passed their home, still dripping river water. Her father, a veteran of the First World War, reportedly observed, "When an enemy can drive trucks through rivers, defeat is inevitable." This realization spread rapidly. The sudden collapse of the Rhine barrier undermined any belief in prolonged resistance. Potential guerrilla movements never materialized. Acceptance of defeat followed not solely from battlefield losses, but from the recognition that Germany could not compete with the industrial logic now on display. Winston Churchill, who personally witnessed the operation, later reflected on it in his memoirs with unusual emphasis. He described the Rhine crossing not as a triumph of clever maneuver, but as evidence of a new way of waging war. European powers had sought victory through planning and strategy. The Americans achieved it through organization and production. Watching the amphibious trucks emerge from the water, Churchill noted that they were neither beautiful nor sophisticated, yet they were perfectly suited to their purpose. To him, they symbolized not technological brilliance, but managerial genius, pragmatism over perfection. Standing on the eastern bank of the Rhine in late March 1945, he felt he was witnessing more than the final breach of Nazi Germany's defenses. He believed he was seeing the opening act of a new global era, one defined by American industrial capacity.
6 weeks later, on May 7, 1945, Germany formally surrendered. Among the reasons cited by General Alfred Jodl was the Allies' unexpected ability to overcome the Rhine so quickly. The river had not been conquered through brilliance or sacrifice alone, it had been rendered irrelevant. In that sense, the DUKW's legacy was not merely military. It marked a shift in how power would be measured in the modern world, not by the perfection of individual weapons, but by the ability to produce, deploy, and sustain systems faster than any adversary could adapt. The Rhine crossing and the industrial turning point of modern warfare. Hidden within broader post-war explanations that emphasized air campaigns, command decisions, and pressure from the Eastern Front, one understated acknowledgement quietly revealed the true catalyst behind the collapse of Germany's final natural defense. In his concluding assessment as Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower attributed an unusually large share of operational success to an unglamorous, lightly built vehicle, the DUKW Amphibious truck. Among all the machines deployed during the final campaign in Western Europe, Eisenhower concluded that none accelerated Germany's defeat more decisively. The amphibious truck altered the very logic of movement and supply. Rivers that had long dictated the pace of armies ceased to function as barriers. What had once constrained logistics became a multiplier of speed and flexibility. The cumulative effect was not merely tactical efficiency, but time itself, measured in weeks, perhaps even months, removed from the duration of the war. The last recorded operational crossing of the Rhine by a DUKW took place on May 10, 1945, 2 days after Germany formally capitulated. By then, the mission no longer involved combat troops or ammunition. Instead, the truck carried food and relief supplies to civilian populations stranded by demolished bridges and shattered infrastructure. The same vehicle that had nullified Germany's final military obstacle was now serving an entirely different purpose: humanitarian support. The driver of that final crossing, Private First Class Anthony DeMarco, later described the moment with striking simplicity. There was no incoming fire, no thunder of artillery, only the steady movement of the vehicle across the water. On the far bank, children waited, hoping for sweets. Only months earlier, many of their fathers had been fighting desperately to prevent such a crossing. The contrast, DeMarco recalled, captured the essence of what the amphibious trucks represented: tools that converted impossibility into routine and transformed enemies into civilians in need. The Rhine operation of March 1945 occupies a pivotal place in military history, not solely because of its operational success, but because of what it signaled about the evolution of warfare itself. The Duk was not heavily armored nor technologically sophisticated by conventional standards. It lacked elegance and intimidation, yet it rendered meaningless a geographic defense that had protected Central Europe for roughly 2,000 years. German planners had prepared meticulously for every scenario their doctrine considered plausible. What they could not account for was scale. They did not imagine that the United States could manufacture more than 21,000 amphibious vehicles capable of driving off assembly lines and directly into rivers. Their preparations were not flawed due to negligence or incompetence, but because their strategic imagination could not encompass the productive capacity of American industry. Between March 23 and March 31, 1945, hundreds of ducks crossed the Rhine, moving personnel, equipment, and supplies in a continuous flow. What they delivered extended beyond material cargo. Each vehicle demonstrated that the foundational assumptions of warfare, terrain as destiny, rivers as limits, were no longer absolute. German soldiers watching these trucks climb onto the eastern bank were witnessing the erosion of constraints that had governed military planning for centuries. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery later summarized the operation with uncharacteristic restraint. The Allies, he said, had not launched an assault across the Rhine, they had simply commuted. That observation captured the deeper achievement, the conversion of an extraordinary military feat into an almost administrative task. The Rhine crossing illustrated a principle that would define modern conflict. Industrial capacity, when effectively organized and applied, could accomplish outcomes unattainable through tactical brilliance alone. The Wehrmacht, arguably one of the most professionally trained and disciplined military forces in history, was not overcome by superior battlefield genius, it was outproduced. Swimming trucks, built in massive numbers on American factory floors, achieved what centuries of strategy could not. Ironically, German pre-war assessments had been correct in one crucial respect. The Rhine could not be forced under determined resistance using traditional methods. The flaw in their logic was assuming that tradition would remain relevant. They did not anticipate that industrial innovation would render those methods obsolete. The amphibious trucks that entered the Rhine in 1945 were not merely vehicles of transport, they carried forward a new model of warfare, one in which manufacturing strength outweighed natural defenses, where quantity defeated refinement, and where flexible innovation dismantled rigid doctrine. The endearing lesson of the Rhine crossing was not purely military, but industrial. In the total wars of the 20th century, victory increasingly belonged not to the most skilled soldiers alone, but to the nations capable of producing at scale. The German defenders were unaware that amphibious trucks existed in such abundance, not because intelligence failed, but because abundance itself was inconceivable to them. That failure of imagination, more than any miscalculation on the battlefield, sealed the fate of the Third Reich's final stand along its most sacred river.